Hello and welcome back to another Mr. Carter Science Special. Today we're going to be looking at coordination and response. We're going to be looking at nerves, we're going to be looking at your reflexes, how do they work, and we're going to compare them to the hormonal system. So, as always, keep your eye on the learning outcomes as we move through this PowerPoint so that you can follow where you are in the course syllabus. So, I'd like you to consider this gentleman here. There he is, playing football. Think of all the different things that are happening in his body to allow him to react to the situation that he's in. You've all probably played tennis, you've all played some kind of sport, you've all seen accidents where you need to move quickly out of the way of, say, a ball coming towards your head. But how is it that different parts of your body can communicate with each other to make certain that cells, for example, in your eyes can send a message to your muscles so that you can see a ball and leap to try and defend it like the goalkeeper is? Or how is it your body can recognize that the temperature in the room you're in has got a little bit higher and maybe it's time for you to start sweating to help cool you down? Well, your body in effect is controlled by two different communication systems. So these two systems are the nervous system and the endocrine system that uses hormones. And the systems have two different functions for different situations which allow your body to adapt to different situations. For example, the nervous system uses electrical nerve impulses and they allow a very quick response to a stimulus, but these stimuluses don't last. So you get a quick response, but the response is short. However, if you look at the endocrine system, this is a system that uses hormones. Hormones are proteins that are made by glands, and the hormones are transported in the blood to target organs. And this is a very slow process. So hormones tend to work slowly, but the effects of a hormone last a much longer time. For example, insulin is a hormone made by the gland called the pancreas, and the insulin will travel in the blood and move to the liver, and it will have an effect that may last for hours on the reduction of blood sugars in your blood. So this is a much slower response, but a much longer duration for the response, long lasting. So let's have a little look and think about this nervous system in more detail. The nervous system is made up of two parts: the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spine, the brain here, in fact let's use a white, the brain here and your spine here, and neurons. Now neurons come off from the spine and they travel down your body to your muscles. So if we have a look at this gentleman's face here, you can think of all the different muscles that are allowing me to talk to you right now. They're all controlled by a number of different neurons that you can see in this gentleman's face. It's the job of the neurons and the central nervous system to send electrical nerve impulses and connect sensor cells to your muscles. So what is sensitivity? Well, sensitivity comes from how your body reacts to changes in the environment. And a change in the environment, both inside, internally in your body and outside, these changes are known as a stimulus. And there's lots of cells in your body that can sense a stimulus, and these cells are known as receptor cells. So you may have been taught in primary school that there are 5 senses: sight, taste, touch, hearing, and your sense of smell. However, there's actually a lot more senses that you have in your body. You can sense pain, for example. You can sense temperature. You can sense proximity to yourself. You can sense pressure, how much pressure somebody's putting on your body. So you've actually got a large number of different receptor cells which allow you to build up a good understanding of what's going on in the environment around you and inside you. So some examples of these receptor cells are the light receptor cells in the retina of your eyes, the sound receptor cells that you find in your ear, pain receptor cells you find in your skin, temperature receptor cells that you find in your skin. And all of these receptor cells create an impulse which will travel to the central nervous system. And the central nervous system, your brain and your spine, will process this information and send an impulse to the correct effector muscle. And this muscle will then contract and create a response. And these cells, these receptor cells, help to keep your body's internal environment constant. This is known as homeostasis. Or they will allow fast reflexes to try and keep you safe. So different receptor cells receive different types of energy. So what I'd like you to do at this point of the video is just pause the video for a minute. Think about energy in terms of physics. There's the 9 kinds of energy. Think which ones of these types of energy here are going to match with these different receptor cells here. So pause the video, draw down the table, see if you can match them together. We'll go for the answers in a moment. So let's look at the answers. So the retina cells, the receptor cells in the eye, obviously receive light energy. If we're looking at the ear in terms of hearing, then we're looking at the ear receiving sound energy. The ear is also involved in balance. So when we're looking at balance, the ear is receiving kinetic or mechanical energy. The tongue receives chemical energy to help you taste. The nose also receives chemical energy to help you smell. In both cases, we're looking at particles being picked up by the receptor cells so that they can recognize that we have a taste or a smell. In terms of the skin can receive stimuluses such as touch and pressure and pain, and therefore we want touch, pressure, pain receptors, and they're receiving a mechanical or a kinetic energy. If the skin is sensing changes in temperature, then it's receiving heat energy. And if we're looking at muscles which are receiving stimuluses to do with stretch, then we're looking at stretch receptors, which again is a mechanical energy. So we've looked at several words recently in this little PowerPoint. We've looked so far at receptor cells, and these receptor cells will receive a stimulus. We've looked at the idea of effector cells, and these effector cells can sometimes be a gland, but for most of your examples that will come up on the exam will be muscles. So generally effector cells are muscles. And we also need to consider the response. What is going to happen when your body receives a particular stimulus? So we can practice trying to describe what happens in these different situations using this table. On the left hand side we have a list of different stimuluses, and for each stimulus you need to write down what's the receptor in the body that will sense the stimulus, what effector muscle will create, and describe the final response. What will happen when this stimulus occurs? So try and sketch down this table now in your books and try and write down what the effectors are, the receptors and the responses for the different situations. I'll give you a moment to do that. Pause the video and then we'll look at the answers. So here are the answers. With bright light, we would be looking at receptor cells that will be in the eye. And typically that would be the retina cells in the eye. And if you get a bright light shining at you, probably the very first thing that you do is you have a response of maybe closing your eyes. You close your eyelids. So it would be muscles in your eyelids that will control that response. You may also have a secondary response, perhaps of raising up your hand to cover your eyes, and that would be controlled by muscles in your arm. If we had a loud bang or a loud noise going off nearby, then your response might be to cover your ears or to move away from that sound. But how do you get to that response? Well, initially we're going to have receptor cells in your ear, receptor cells in the ear, and they would send an electrical nerve impulse to the central nervous system, which will then send another impulse to your effector muscles, probably in your arms as you cover your ears. If you've got a ball being thrown at you, you're likely to see it first. So again, we would be looking for receptor cells in the eye, or we might say the retina cells. And the response might be for us to duck out of the way. So we'd be looking for muscles in your legs and your back. That would sort of make you cower and duck out of the way. If you sit on a drawing pin, then it's likely to hurt and you're going to feel pain. So it will be a pain receptor in your skin. So a pain receptor in your skin that will create the electrical nerve impulse that would travel eventually to probably muscles in your legs, muscle cells in your legs. And your response is almost certainly that you will stand up. So we're building up here to an idea of a key term in this unit, which is the reflex arc. Again, keep your eye on where we are in the syllabus. So what is this reflex arc? Well, before we get into that, we need to think a little bit about what are reflexes. And in order to measure reflexes, you need to be able to measure reaction time. So you've probably done a practical in your classrooms where you've dropped rulers and tried to capture and hold on to the ruler as fast as you can in a range of different situations, maybe left hand and right hand, maybe concentrating hard or being distracted. And you would always measure reaction time in seconds or often milliseconds because your reaction times can be that fast. Don't be confused by thinking about reaction speeds. If you have a very low reaction time, that is the same as having a very fast reaction speed. So a fast reaction speed or a fast reaction is the same as having a low reaction time, a very small number for your reaction time. So if we consider here our goalkeeper once again, and we think of everything that he has to do, he has to react very, very quickly to the stimulus of the striker trying to put the ball in the back of the net. So he needs to have a very, very fast response. And an incredibly fast automatic response to a stimulus is known as a reflex. A fast automatic response to a stimulus. And then reflexes are brilliant because a reflex will allow a fast response and prevent harm. In this case, for the goalie, it will prevent the opposition team from scoring a goal. But in real life, in most of the situations you'll come across, somebody throwing a ball towards you, a loud noise, a bright light, we're trying to prevent harm to your body. Often maybe harm to the retina cells, harm to your ear cells, or harm to the organs of your body if it's a large enough stimulus coming towards you. So we have to have some way that your body can communicate quickly between the receptor cells and the effector cells. There must be some kind of fast system to allow communication, and that system is known as the reflex arc. And it's got a number of different components. The first thing you must have for this to work is a stimulus. And the stimulus will then be felt by the receptor cells, as we've already gone into, and the receptor cells will create a nerve impulse. And that nerve impulse will travel along some nerves to the central nervous system, which will be the brain or the spine. And they will then create another electrical nerve impulse, and that impulse will then travel to the effector muscle cells, and eventually you will get a response. Now this is a very simplified version of the reflex arc. As it's an arc, it generally has a different shape, a shape more like this, a curved shape. So here we have a slightly more detailed version of the reflex arc. We've started off with a stimulus. So what kind of stimuluses could we have? Well, we could have maybe sound or heat or pain or light, and they will be felt by a number of different receptor cells depending on what the stimulus is. So it may be temperature receptors, it may be receptor cells in your eyes or your ears or your nose, and they will then be carried along a neuron. Now this first neuron is known as the sensory neuron. And that sensory neuron will then carry the message to the central nervous system, which is your brain and your spine. The brain and the spine will carry the nerve impulse and nerve message along to the next neuron, and that will be the motor neuron. And the motor neuron carries a message to the different effector cells that you may well have. And these, as we've said, by and large, will be muscle cells. And we will end up getting some kind of a response, generally some kind of movement response from the muscles as the muscle cells contract. Now, it's important to remember that muscles can only do two things. They can relax and they can contract, and that's it. When a muscle gets an electrical nerve impulse, it contracts. Very simple. So we can look at this in a little bit more detail. This is a classic diagram here where we have somebody accidentally touching a pin. Well, what would your response be? Well, it's likely to be that if you touch a pin, you move your hand out of the way very, very fast. That's a normal response. It's a reflex, a fast automatic response to a stimulus. It prevents harm to your body. But we might have to describe this in more detail in an exam. It might be a 6-mark question. How would we do that? Well, we need to be able to describe each component of the reflex arc and say what's going on. So for this example, we would start with the stimulus here, and we would say when you touch a pin, the finger touching the pin is the stimulus. Pain receptors in the hand sense the stimulus and create an electrical nerve impulse. Electrical nerve impulse. The electrical nerve impulse is then carried along the sensory neuron, and we've got an example of a sensory neuron there, so you have an idea of what they look like. The electrical nerve impulse is then carried to the central nervous system, where the electrical nerve impulse is carried through relay neurons, and they have a different structure. The relay neurons send the electrical nerve impulse to motor neurons, and motor neurons will then carry the electrical nerve impulse to the effectors, in this case muscles in the arm, which will contract so that we will have our response and the hand will move away. So we could have a large number of marks by fully explaining this. If you name the stimulus and say what it is, that's 1 mark. Name the receptor cells and tell us that they create electrical nerve impulses, we've got 2. Then in order, name the correct neurons, and that's another 3 marks. And then describe the effector and explain what it's going to do, contract, and describe the response. So you could easily have 8 or 9 marks that you could potentially be awarded in a 6-mark question. So let's see now if you can do this on your own. Here we've got a very simple question. What happens when you touch a hot flame? And we've given you a nice diagram that you might get in an exam question to try and help you fully explain this. I've also given you a number of keywords here. So what I would suggest you do right now, pause the video and then write a paragraph in your book. Try and see if you can get all 6 marks. Try and use the idea of the reflex arc to fully explain what happens when you touch a hot flame. Remember, you're fully explaining. We're not looking for a quick, simple answer here. If you need a little bit of help, then here is a gap fill giving you a perfect answer, but we're missing some key words, but I've been kind enough to give you some of the first letters of those key words. Pause the video now if you want to copy this down. So here's the answers, and we'll go through and we'll try and show you where the marks are for each of for this particular 6-mark question. So when you touch a hot flame, the hot flame is the stimulus. Temperature and pain receptor cells in the skin create an electrical nerve impulse which is sent along the sensory neuron to the central nervous system. Relay neurons in the spine send the impulse to motor neurons. The motor neurons send the impulse to effector muscles in the arm. The muscles contract and the arm moves away from the flame. This is the response. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 potential answers so far in the first paragraph. But we haven't considered what happens when neurons touch each other. Well, when the sensory neuron gets into the central nervous system, it does not touch the relay neuron. In fact, there is a very small gap. So if ever I'm drawing a reflex arc, I will draw the sensory neuron very simply as an arrow, and then I will leave a small gap and I'll draw the relay neuron, and I'll leave a small gap and I'll draw the motor neuron. So we would have the sensory neuron going to the relay neuron, going to the motor neuron. And these small gaps are very, very important because these small gaps are known as the synapse. And in an exam question like this, you can actually pick up some extra marks for talking about the synapse and saying that to carry the nerve impulse across the synapse, we need to have some neurotransmitters. These are just little special protein chemicals that quickly move across the synapse and carry the electrical nerve impulse with them. We could also discuss the advantage and say the advantage of a reflex is that it provides a fast response and prevents damage to the body. In this case, more damage from a burning flame. So here we have our original example again, and we have the pin, in this case, touching the skin. But there's a few extra things to notice on this diagram, particularly as we look here and we get into the central nervous system. So if we follow the electrical nerve impulse as it moves up the sensory neuron, you'll see that the sensory neuron enters the spine here. And at this point, the spine splits into two and the sensory neuron moves along the top part of that, which is known as the dorsal root. So the sensory neuron enters the spine through the dorsal root, and the dorsal root has a swelling known as the dorsal root ganglion. And this is where all the nucleuses in the cell body of the sensory neuron are found. So we need just that little bit of extra space to contain all of those nucleuses. When the electrical nerve impulse leaves the central nervous system, in this case the spine, then it comes out along the bottom area here. Do that again so we can see it. It comes out along the bottom area, which is known as the ventral root. So the motor neuron will leave the spine through the ventral root. You'll also notice that we have two different colours. We have a greyish colour here and a whitish colour for the rest of the spine. What's the difference? Well, the grey area is made up of relay neurons and their cell bodies, whereas the white matter, as it's known, grey matter and white matter, is made up of axons and the myelin sheath that's around the outside of the axon that insulates the axon and allows the nerve impulses to travel very, very quickly. So on the next two slides, we've got a range of questions which you can pause the video, try these questions and see how much you've learned. Try and use full sentences when answering these questions. So we've got 7 questions on this slide and a further 5 questions on this slide. So pause the video now, try and answer those questions, and I'll give you the answers in a moment. So here are the answers. The first question says, state the name of a range of senses, and that's your classic 5 senses: sight, touch, hearing, smell, and taste. Define the term stimulus. So stimulus is a change in the environment. Using examples, explain what a receptor cell is. So there's a range of examples you could have gone for. You may have said pain receptors in your skin that detect pain, heat receptors in your skin that detect changes in heat, retina cells in your eye that detect light. We could have had cells in your ears that detect sound, or cells in your ears that detect balance. There's a large range of these. Question 4. Compare and contrast the way nerves and hormones allow cells in the body to communicate with each other. So you should be saying that nerves have a very fast response, but the response is very short. So it's a fast reflex or a fast response time, but a very short length of that response. Whereas with the hormones, we have a very slow response, but a long-lasting response. You could also mention that in nerves we need an electrical nerve impulse, but with the hormonal response, obviously we need hormones that travel in the blood. So explain what the nervous system is. So the nervous system is a system that is composed of 2 different sections. We have the central nervous system containing relay neurons, and then we have the rest of the nervous system made up of motor neurons and sensory neurons. Give some examples of receptor cells and name the types of energy they receive. Well, if you completed the table earlier in this video, then you will have already done that. And likewise for question 7, complete the table on slide 10. For each stimulus, name the receptor, the effector, and the final response. If you've completed that, you can go back and look at the answers for that in this video. So the next 5 questions. Draw a diagram of the reflex arc. Well, I'm not going to draw the full diagram here for you, but please pause the video and go back and look at the examples. But remember, in most of the time, we're looking for a reflex arc that has the 3 neurons fully labelled with the gap of the synapse there. So we would have the sensory neuron, the relay neuron, the motor neuron. We could label the synapse. We could also make certain that we are always starting with our stimulus, which is felt by receptor cells. And they send the message along the sensory neuron across the synapse to the relay neuron, across another synapse to the motor neuron, which goes to an effector muscle, and we end up with a response. And the whole system has a curved arc. Describe what happens when your finger touches a pin. So draw a diagram of a reflex arc, name the stimulus, the receptor, the effector, and the response, and try and use that paragraph system that we were using earlier. So I would expect you to say that when your finger touches a pin, the pin is the stimulus. Pain receptors in your skin sense the stimulus and create an electrical nerve impulse which travels along the sensory neuron and is carried across the synapse to the relay neuron by neurotransmitters. The electrical nerve impulse then travels through the relay neuron in the central nervous system. And that could either be the brain or the spine, depending on whichever is closest to your stimulus. Often it's just the spine. The electrical nerve impulse then crosses another synapse and is carried along the motor neuron to the effector muscles In this case, those muscles will be in your arm, which contract, and the response is that you move your arm away from the pin. So you could have up to 7 or 8 marks there for each key point. Question 3, explain what happens when your finger touches a hot flame. Well, if you've completed the gap fill that we've already mentioned in this video, then you can go back and have a look at that and get yourself 6 marks there. For a bit of extension, describe the function of the dorsal root and the ventral root in the spine. So the function of the dorsal root is to carry the sensory neuron, spell that correctly, to carry the sensory neuron, and don't forget we've got the ganglion body where the cell bodies from the sensory neuron and the nucleuses are housed, and the ventral root, its function is to carry the motor neuron. Compare and contrast white matter and grey matter. Well, white matter is made up of the parts of the sensory and motor neuron known as axons and dendrites, and grey matter is made up of the relay neurons. Relay neurons have very, very short dendrons and dendrites, so largely with a relay neuron you're looking at the cell body and the nucleuses, which is why it has a much darker appearance under a microscope. In the next video we'll go into looking at the structure of the different neurons in greater detail, so you can really compare and contrast and see the difference between those. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. Please don't forget to like and subscribe so that you will get first access to the new videos as they're created on the Mr. Carter Science Special YouTube channel. Thank you very much.